Okay, now, the topic of this course, ancient Israelite history. Now, who are the ancient Israelites? What's the difference between the ancient Israelites and the non-ancient Israelites, or the Jews, right? Does anyone have any clue? The difference between the Jews and the Israelites? Go ahead.
The term Jew or Judaism didn't arise until after the kingdom of Judea came to exist, I think.
That's a very good effort, but that's actually not quite true. Because the kingdom of Judea existed during the period of the Israelites. The kingdom of Judea, according to the Bible at least, started with David, which is the 11th century BC, which is still the period of the ancient Israelites. So Jewish usually refers to the Second Temple period, not the First Temple period. It's actually incorrect, scientifically speaking, to refer to the people, the ancestors of the Jews, okay, to refer to them as Jews, because they weren't Jews. The First Temple, they were Israelites. Or, if they lived in the south, where modern Jerusalem is, then they would be called Judahites or Judeans. But the term Jewish is incorrect. But anyway,
What's Israelites?
Israelites is the north. The north meaning, what's the dividing line? Roughly Bethel. What is it in modern Israel?
Bethel, what is that?
I'm talking about, historically, it's the name of a city. Bethel.
Yeah,
right?
that was
right.
south.
That's roughly the dividing line between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. There used to be two separate kingdoms, right?
No.
You're not aware of that?
You mean like the Galilee?
What?
Okay.
That was the two kingdoms.
Okay, there were two kingdoms. There was the northern kingdom. There was Rehoboam, right? Rehoboam. He ruled in the south, and there was Jeroboam. He ruled in the north. He ruled in the north, right?
What?
Nobody knows what I'm talking about?
But what period?
Because you're supposed to educate us.
No,
what period are you
I'm sorry.
talking?
Okay.
It was a period of time that you're talking about.
The period of the Bible. There were
No.
two kings.
No.
Well,
After
you're talking
Solomon-
about during the
After
it's in
Solomon,
Nevi'im.
right?
It's
After
in
Solomon.
Nevi'im. It's not
Right.
the
For how long?
period
It's
of
not in Torah, correct.
For how long?
Okay, so
Right.
so be
For how
more.
long
Can you be
after-
more specific?
Okay, after Solomon died, there were two kings who ruled over the united monarchy, right? Over everyone. That was David and Solomon.
Okay.
So that was approximately two generations, right?
And what
Actually,
year
more.
did
Shaul was
Shlomo
before.
finish?
That's from 10 BC, okay, until about 930 BC.
Okay, so
that's
starting
80 years.
So starting 930.
Right, starting
There was the
930,
split
there
of
were
the
two
two
separate
kingdoms.
kingdoms. I'm sorry that I took it for granted. I thought everyone knew
Hold
that.
Well, one second. You're
BC.
mixing up. David was
goes
not the
backward.
first king.
BC.
Pardon me?
When you
Everything
talk
is
about,
BC. Everything
if
in
you
this
talk
class is going
about
to be BC.
BC, then a larger number is earlier than.
Yeah,
Correct.
10 to
So you said-
930.
Correct.
Oh, you said 10.
10 to 930.
10.
One second.
Yeah.
Shaul
Yeah, by the
Shaul
way,
was
everything in
first.
this class, whenever I mention a date, it's always going to be before Christ or before the Common Era, whichever you prefer. Okay,
One
before
second. David
before
was
the
not
millennium.
first king.
What?
King David was not the first. Shaul was
He-
first.
Yes.
It was the first full time.
Yeah,
Shaul
true,
got kicked
true.
off. but-
Saul was, but during Saul's time, they still had a lot of difficulty with the Philistines. And so they didn't have full control over all the territories. There's a lot of friction going on there. So David is the first time, according to the Bible, okay, there's a lot of, if you continue coming to my classes, then you'll find out that there's a lot of controversy whether the biblical description of the kingdom of David is actually accurate. But according to, if you take it at face value, then he ruled over a solid kingdom. I mean, his borders were secure, and it was a united kingdom, and it was both in the north and in the south. Okay, so that's going to be the topic of this class in general. This particular presentation right now is going to focus on the patriarchal period, okay? That period of the Israelite history. So presumably the patriarchs are portrayed in the Bible as the ancestors of the Israelites, right? You have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then the 12 tribes of Israel, and they gave birth to the Israelites. And so we're going to focus on that period, the period of the patriarchs. Okay, let's
Can we get a
start.
year
Slide.
for Abraham? Like, let's say the birth of Abraham?
View.
Slideshow.
Views. It's slideshow.
I don't know. I'm asking
It's
him.
about to
From
start.
current slide.
Okay.
From current slide.
Okay.
Hello, I formatted it.
Okay, patriarchal history in a nutshell. So first we're going to go over what the Bible tells us about the history, and then we're going to dissect it and see if it matches up to...
Could you just give us a year for the birth of Abraham, just so I...
Yes, we're going to discuss this.
Oh, okay.
Everything's going
Thank
to be
you.
discussed in this class.
Thank you.
Okay, so first, according to the biblical account, Abraham was the son of Terach. And he left Ur in southern Mesopotamia, and he travels to Haran in northwest Mesopotamia. I'm going to show you a map in just a second. But first, the city of Ur, right? Ur Kasdim, in English it's translated as Ur of the Chaldees. Okay, who are the Chaldees? The Kasdim. These are historical people. It's not just a word. It actually means something. The Chaldees were people who lived in the 7th century BC. Okay, that's basically a year before the first temple was destroyed. Much later than the time that Abraham presumably lived in. Okay, I'm going to get back to this in a second, but this seems to be an anachronism. An anachronism means something that is not accurate in the time setting that you're discussing. In other words, if Abraham actually came from Ur of the Chaldees, then he didn't come from the Ur of the Chaldees, he came from Ur, which later was called Ur of the Chaldees, because the Chaldees didn't exist. He didn't live among the Chaldees, for sure not. The Chaldees didn't exist until a millennium later, more than a millennium later, as we shall discuss further. The period of Abraham was approximately 2000 BC, if he existed as a real person. All right, so I'm going to show you a map in the next slide. So he moved to Haran. Haran is quite a distance from Ur. And then he went out, his family remained in Haran, and his father died there, his brother died there, and he and Lot continued southwards to what is Canaan. Now, I want to give you like a little bit of a geography here of the Near East here, so you understand the terms that I'm using here. First of all, Mesopotamia. Does anyone know what that is? Okay. You want to define it?
Me?
Yeah, you.
Mesopotamia was the first place that civilization, that we know, that history knows that civilization was formed. Civilization meaning that hunter-gatherers or just tribes living in the wild came together to live, to kind of share economically, share in other ways. Again, I'm not an
But
historian.
what does it literally mean? Is it,
It's a geographical. Yeah,
Go
okay.
ahead, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, say.
It's a geographical
you know,
place.
you know what it means literally?
I
No.
can answer
All
that.
right.
Meso means between, and Potamia is the river.
That is correct. Mesopotamia, between the rivers.
The Tigris
And it
and
refers to the two
Euphrates.
rivers, Tigris and the Euphrates. And this is a Greek term. Mesopotamia is a Greek term. But this equivalent in a different language already existed. For example, in the Bible, it's Aram Naharaim. What does Naharaim mean? Between the rivers. So the word Naharaim is a Hebrew equivalent of Mesopotamia. A literal, in fact, the Greek term may have been derived from that because the Septuagint, of course, which was written in Greek, was translating the Bible. So a lot of Greek terminology relating to the Bible was simply translating the Bible, and that's how we got the term. So if those Greek translators translated Naharaim literally between the rivers, then this is how we got the term Mesopotamia. At any rate, Mesopotamia refers to the entire, this is a huge stretch of land that stretches all the way from the Persian Gulf to Syria and even Turkey. So this is a long stretch of land. I'm going to show you a map. Let's see if it shows up. Here it is. Okay. So you have, here you see the two blue lines are the rivers, and it stretches from the, let's see if this works. Oh, I can use my mouse as a pointer. Okay, from here, from the southeast, right, all the way northwesternly route, and this is Haran here. Okay, so this is all part of Mesopotamia between those blue lines. Now here, this coast here, the coast of the Mediterranean, this is what's called the Levant. This is a modern scholastic term, the Levant. It's not used in politics, it's not used in any other circles, it's only used in biblical archaeology and in biblical geography. The Levant actually is a French word, and it means the rising, meaning east, the rising of the sun. So this is, where's my mouse? Okay, so this whole coast of the Mediterranean, the eastern coast, is called the Levant. It includes modern Israel, Syria, and Lebanon actually. But Lebanon, we're not going to refer to it as Lebanon because that's a modern political designation. It's usually called Syria. This whole area here is called Syria. All right, so and
Lebanon is...
Levant, it's L-E-V-A.
No, I know Levant. What I'm saying, Lebanon appears in the biblical
Yeah, but that's
term, right?
completely unrelated to Levant. Levant is a French word.
I know
Right.
those two things. I'm just saying
Lebanon, yeah, yeah.
Lebanon. You're saying
It
Lebanon
does.
is...
Yeah, it does appear
is
in the Bible.
Lebanon.
The reason why we don't call it Lebanon is because the Greeks didn't call it Lebanon. Most of the terms that we have, Mesopotamia is a Greek term. Syria is a Greek term. All right? even Palestine is actually a Roman term. The Romans, they wanted to wipe out any memory of the political existence of Judea, and so after they finally got rid of the kingdom of Judea in 135 after the Bar Kokhba revolt, they just wiped it out. No more Judea. It's Palestine, and that name stuck to this very day. And
With Syria, right.
until 1948. And in 1948,
From
some
when?
Jews wanted to recreate this thing, and then others say no, we're going to continue calling it Palestine. But anyway, let's not go into politics.
But
So-
Lebanon is
Lebanon,
a geographic
it's a
area.
biblically accurate geographical term, but like from a historical standpoint, nobody called it Lebanon in modern history. Okay, and from let's say 600 BC, from the times that the Greeks came onto the scene, which is several centuries later actually, but from the time that we have history, right? People are talking and writing about history. It wasn't referred to as a geographical unit as Lebanon. It's part of Syria. All right, so, and the other term you should be familiar with is the Fertile Crescent. Sound familiar?
Mhm.
Anyone? Okay. The Fertile Crescent. Why is it called a crescent? Because it's in the shape of a crescent, and it's fertile.
What's the it?
Where
you're
is it?
referring
Right
to?
here, you see it, this blue, the two rivers here, delineated by the blue lines. This is the right arch of the crescent, and you see that it widens as it reaches its peak in the middle, and then the left arm of the crescent is the Levant.
Could you draw the whole crescent, or?
Let's see if I can have. Hold on a second.
I think that red line is the.
Give me a second here. Pointer options. Highlighter. Okay, here. I'm gonna draw the crescent.
I see.
Is this clear?
What is
So it
this
becomes
question?
wider at the top, and then it narrows again toward Hebron, along the coast of the Mediterranean. So this was fertile territory, very fertile. You had the two rivers, between the two rivers, so that irrigated this area. And here you have the Orontes River, which eventually empties into the Jordan. So, of course, towards the south it becomes more arid and less fertile, but the northern parts of it, in Syria and the northern Israel, is still fertile. And this is considered the Hula Valley, for example. Has anyone heard of that term, Hula Valley? It's in the Galilee, a very fertile area. So, in fact, if you go to Israel, that's the only place where you can find green grass. And it's also a place where the birds stop by during their migrations to feed. So this is the Fertile Crescent. It's a term that was used by scholars in the mid-19th century, and it's stuck, and it became really popular.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
So Egypt was never part of Mesopotamia?
No,
Wow, that's news to me.
no. Egypt is the Nile River. Egypt also fed off a river, which is also interesting to note that ancient societies needed a river to survive. That was the very earliest form of agriculture was practiced alongside a river. Why? Because rainfall was unreliable. Sometimes it rains, sometimes it doesn't. But a river is always reliable because the river, where does the river get its rain? From the mountains, right? So somewhere along the mountain there's going to be rain, right? So in other words, you don't have to rely on local rain. Even if it rains remotely, eventually that water will come to you. And the river also has the advantage that once you figure out how to irrigate it, how to construct irrigation canals, then you can really maneuver it and you can tame it, right? You can divert it to where you want it to go. So you have a lot of control with the river. And you don't have that as much with rainwater. So the early centers of civilization that thrived on agriculture were located along either the Tigris-Euphrates, the Mesopotamia, or along the Nile River.
So Egypt had a civilization, the very first that we know that we usually in beginning.
Egypt and Mesopotamia, those are the first agricultural civilizations. Which one came first? I don't think anybody knows. They're more or less the same time.
Were there other civilizations other than agricultural civilizations?
The word civilization usually implies agriculture because if you don't have agriculture, then it's never going to reach the point of civilization. Civilization implies writing, and the people who were hunters and gatherers didn't have writing. So writing, state, political states, the fact that you control an empire, for example, these ideas depend on agriculture. Before agriculture, before about, let's say, 5,000 BC, that's approximately when agriculture first began. So before that, you didn't have this. All right.
May I make just a quick comment? It's interesting,
Mm-hmm.
Jacob, that the traditional dates of creation sort of coincide somewhat with the traditional date, with the scholarly date of beginning of civilization. It's just the point.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, about 5,000 BC. Actually, no, that would be 3,000 BC.
Roughly.
Right. But 3,000 BC is when we start getting history. It is assumed that 5,000 BC people started, at least the beginnings of started cultivating certain grains. But as far as detailed historical records, we have beginning 3,000 BC. Sumeria, of course, the kingdom, the empire of Sumer and Akkad. We'll get to that later. Okay, so let's discuss patriarchal history. That's our focus here. That's the topic of the class. So, patriarchal history is characterized by private affairs. Most of the stories that we see there is about people, not about kingdoms. Okay, there are some stories there about, for example, the 5 kings versus the 4 kings. Kidala Omer, king of Elam, he led an expedition against the kings from the valley in Canaan, right? The Sodom and Gomorrah. And so we have a story like that, which pertains to the public domain, but for the most part, most of the stories are private. So the problem with private affairs is that it's more difficult to corroborate. Because typically historical records are going to refer to either a major king, a person who has had an influence on history, right? Or it's going to refer to other major events in history. It's not going to refer to people who are relatively obscure. So there's, needless to say, we don't find any records of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob directly in any of the external sources. And neither would we expect. It doesn't mean that they didn't exist because of that. We wouldn't expect, let's say, the archives at Mari or Ebla or any of these other cities where scholars have discovered records of the ancient life. We wouldn't expect for Abraham to show up there. But on the other hand, we cannot corroborate the events either. There is no mention of Melchizedek, king of Salem. You guys remember that story? Melchizedek, Melech Shalem, Hotzi Lechem V'Yoyin, when Abraham returned after rescuing his nephew Lot from the king of Sodom, from Amraphel and Kedorlaomer, the Mesopotamian kings. And so the king of Sodom came out before him, and he Hotzi Lechem V'Yoyin. So there's no mention of that. Abimelech, king of Gerar, he is not mentioned. The city of Gerar existed, but not the name of Abimelech. And Potiphar is an Egyptian officer, and he was the master of Joseph. He's not mentioned anywhere. Hamor, the son of Shechem, also one of the biblical stories, Shimon and Levi, right? They destroyed the city of Shechem. So according to the Bible, Shechem was the son of Hamor. No mention of him. Ephron the Hittite, he is the one who sold a parcel of land to Abraham, which he later converted into a tomb. And here's another interesting thing. The Edomite kings, Genesis 36. This is actually a very problematic piece of text because the Edomites didn't quite exist yet at the time of the patriarchs. The Edomites is a much later people. In fact, according to our sources, the first time they appear on the historical scene is not until the Assyrians, which is the 7th century BC, much later than the time of the patriarchs. But that just shows, that really takes us into a different question, which is when the Bible was written. Okay, so this just shows that at least Genesis 36, at least this portion of the Bible that lists the Edomite kings, was not written until much, much later. The Pharaoh of the Joseph story, the word Pharaoh is not a proper name. It just means whoever was the king of Egypt was the Pharaoh. So he's not identified by name, so it's difficult for us to know who it was.
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
You said there were only private affairs, but there were some. You said with some exceptions, but let's take other than the whole affair there with the war and kings. And again, this is much more than a private affair. This is something that usually does leave records because there were lots of people killed, and lots of people are killed. There's some graves for them, etc., etc. So such things do usually leave some kind of record.
They should have, right.
Right.
But we don't have any records though. The 4 kings against the 5 kings, We don't have any records of that war.
Okay, so yeah, but then we can't really categorize it as a private affair. But other than that, there was a big famine in Egypt. Do we have any record of? I mean,
In Canaan, you mean?
In Egypt. In
Famine in Egypt?
Famine in Egypt. At the end of Genesis, there's
Not in Egypt. In
7
Canaan.
years. 7 years of very.
Oh, that no, there's no record of that either. But I don't think no. On the contrary, no, it doesn't say there was a famine. It says that there would be a famine unless there was a drought. Maybe a famine means you don't have what to eat.
Right.
According to the Bible, what Joseph accomplished is that there shouldn't be a famine because he saved. He
And
saved up.
There was a famine, but only Egypt was saved, and everyone was coming to Egypt. Whoever had money.
There was a famine in Canaan,
in the whole West.
in the land of Canaan, according to the Bible. But such an event is not. It's not. We don't have any historical setting that we can assign it to, because I mean the land of Canaan wasn't a very fertile land. So I mean it's liable to be famines there all the time. That's why people didn't live there for the most part. People lived between the rivers, right, in Mesopotamia and in Egypt. The section I didn't mention that earlier, but the actual what we call the land of Canaan, modern Israel, is not a very fertile area except for the regions to the north. But where the Bible describes Abraham to have journeyed, which is the southern sections, Hebron, for example, that's not a fertile area. It borders the Judean desert.
So what about the tomb of the patriarchs? When did that first appear in history? I mean, if we assume that all those patriarchs, that they're all private people, and we don't really know, we can't really know. So what do we know about places like the tomb of the patriarchs? Is that how it's called in English? Martha, or even the cave of Raphael?
The modern tomb of the patriarchs is not historical. We don't know nothing about that. Somebody made that up. There's no continuity with that. I mean,
So when
there's no
did it
tradition
first
that
appear?
goes back all the way to the time when we know that the actual people who were buried there who were the patriarchs of the Israelites.
But where does it first appear?
Oh, there's a lot of places like that. There's, for example, Jebel Musa, right? Mount Sinai. There's a place called Mount Sinai in the Sinai Desert. Again, it's not historical. The Christians set up a convent there in about the 4th century, and somebody decided later that this is Jebel Musa. And there's tons of examples like this. In fact, the Arizal, right? He went around in the 18th, 19th century, whenever he lived, I don't know when, and he started saying, this is the caver of Reb Meir Balanes. This is the caver of... Where he took that, I don't know. Nobody knows. I mean, if you believe in divine revelation, then maybe God told him that this is the caver of Reb Meir Balanes, but it's not historical. It's not like there was an actual tradition that you can... and if you open the caver, what are you going to see there? I don't know. Maybe some bones, but it's certainly not...
There is no way to attribute that to the actual person.
No. Most decidedly not. And the modern Ars Machpelah is meaningless from a historical standpoint. Maybe, it evokes certain emotions. And
1 second, why is it? Why you say it's nothing?
because there's no tradition. That's what I'm trying to explain to you.
There's a building on top of that.
There's a building, very nice, but it doesn't relate.
Underneath the building.
It doesn't relate to historical figures. Okay, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The chances that they're there is about 1 in a million. They could have been anywhere else. We don't know that they're there.
It was always known at that place. They were there.
It's not always known. Okay, I don't want to focus on that because that's besides
Just
that.
for a second, Jacob, to comment about the name of the pharaoh. Perhaps there's some kind of clue in Eretz Ramses. Perhaps there's some kind of clue in Eretz Ramses, right? In other words, that may be some kind of clue, right? Because Ramses is, right? Just mentioning that, right?
All right, so now we're going to go back to your question. The chronology, right? When did Abraham live? Right? So in order to investigate further into the historicity of Abraham, we first want to identify what period he lived in according to the Bible. Okay? Let's first take the biblical version at face value, and let's see what they say. Okay, so we have Abraham. He's 75 years old when he first leaves Ur of the Chaldees. Oh no, when he first leaves Haran. And then he arrives in Canaan, and then he's 100 when he has Isaac. Isaac is 60 when he begets Jacob, and Jacob is 130 when he dies. So the patriarchal years is 215 total. And then you have the period of slavery, which is 430 years. This is in Exodus 12:40. ומושב בני ישראל אשר ישבו במצרים 400 שנה ושלושים שנה. Does that ring a bell? 430 years. So we have 430 years, and then in 1 Kings it says that the construction of the temple took place in the 4th year of Solomon. So and it says that it's 480 years. 480 years after the Exodus. So if we tabulate all the years, then we have about 1,000 years from the time of Abraham until the construction of the temple. Now, why is the construction of the temple important? Because now we're entering into an era where we have some information. In other words, the biblical account starts meshing in with history, with actual history. There's a thing called the Shishonk inscription. Has anyone heard of that? Yes. The Shishonk inscription. Okay. The Shishonk inscription. You want to say?
No,
What?
go ahead. It's your class. Come on.
I want participation. Okay, it's going to show up on the slides later. But the Shishonk inscription is Pharaoh in Shishonk. He was the 21st dynasty probably. This is the 9th century BC, and it is said that 10th century. After Solomon died in about 930. So he led an expedition into Egypt, and he exacted tribute, and he went all the way. He went north, and I don't know what he did exactly, but he left a trail of destruction. And so he recorded all this in the Shishonk inscription, which is inscribed on a stone in where is it located? I think it's in Karnak, if I'm not mistaken, which is a city in Egypt, which is where he had that was his headquarters, his capital. And so the Shishonk inscription is dated. Okay, we know about the Egyptians much more than we know. I mean, they left everything. They were a very advanced society. They recorded everything. So this is dated to about 925 BC. This event, when he raided what is the Canaanite territory, and so we know that this took place in the 4th year of Solomon, which is 966 BCE. Okay, so here we have the actual dates. So if we count back from 966, then it comes out that Abraham lived in the 21st century BC, 2091. And the Exodus is 1446. Okay, this is also a very important thing here. 1446 is the Exodus. Why is this important? Because it creates a lot of difficulties.
You could use the left and right arrows to just skip through.
No, I can't because I'm using the highlighter as my left one, but thanks. So what's the problem with this biblical chronology? Several problems. First of all, it's based on very long lifespans. So we would have to believe, we would be forced to believe that these people actually lived that long. Jacob, for example, living to 130. I mean, modern people don't live that long, and from what we observe in history, people have been getting the lifespan, longevity has been increasing, not decreasing. So that's one issue. In fact, this is such a big problem. It even poses an internal inconsistency because, according to the Tanakh, we have Moses and Aaron who are 4th generation from Jacob, right? And then you have Joshua, who is a descendant from Ephraim, correct? And he, according to Chronicles Divrei Hayam, he is a 12th generation. So this is definitely an inconsistency. I mean, how does 12th generation, they were like literally cousins, right?
Wait a second, according to blah blah blah, Yocheved was 230 years old when she had Moses.
Right. So that's one issue, but even if we are to believe, I'm trying to explain there's two issues here. One is they were too old, but secondly, even if we can explain that, there is an internal inconsistency here. How do you reconcile a 4th generation and a 12th generation? Like, which one is it? I mean, right?
But
I mean, both of them are presumably
years.
descendant from the sons of Jacob. One is descendant from Levi, 4th generation from Levi, and the other one is a 12th generation from, what did you say, Ephraim, right? 12th generation.
Yeah, but the 230 years is
if
opening
those
the
4
gap.
generations took 200 each, and the 12 generations took 30 each, now we can find like
Yeah,
some kind of
right. So that, right, that's what I say here.
Which
So
is a real
we have an
check.
average of 100. No, no,
Right,
you're right.
right.
You have an average of 140 years versus an average of 39 years. Now, I don't know why would they live so much longer than them. I don't know how to explain that. Okay, another issue with this chronology is that if the Exodus was 1446, and if we take the biblical word as at face value, then 40 years earlier, 1406 is when. I'm sorry, 40 years later. 40 years later, 1406 is when the conquest of Canaan should have taken place, because the Israelites wandered 40 years in the desert. So 1406 for the conquest of Canaan, there's absolutely no archaeological remains indicating such a date. Nothing happened essentially in 1406. I mean, according to the book of Joshua, there was major destruction. He went around, he destroyed cities left and right, Jericho, Ai, and Chatzor, and everyone, and nothing happened. Archaeologists have dug up Chatzor, Jericho, and all these other cities, and 1406 was just an uneventful period. The 15th century, nothing really happened in that century.
And Jericho, what they dug up, there is no big walls. It's a small little city. There is nothing
Right.
going on
In that period.
Not
Right.
at all.
Right. The Jericho is a very controversial site. At first, archaeologists used that to corroborate the Bible. They thought that it actually
Did happen.
proves, right? It proves the events. They found the wall there, and they were like all excited. This is the wall of the Bible, and it fell apart, and this is it. But then other scholars came along, and they redated everything, and they found other walls and other layers. It's a many layers in Jericho, much more complicated. And it turns out that upon further examination, that not only does it not support the biblical claims about Jericho, but it actually contradicts. But that's a separate discussion. So, but for now, the focus here, the point here is that in the 15th century, there is no widespread conquest, there's no widespread destruction going on in the land of Canaan. And so what, yes, in the 12th century, that's late 13th, early 12th century, that's the period when scholars have found major chaos going on in the area. What we see is new settlements sprouting up along the central hill country, which is the Galilee basically, and south of it, Shechem, that area, and in fact hundreds of new settlements sprouted up in the late 13th, early 12th, and also the traditional powers, the centers of power, which used to be in the valleys, like Chatzor, Megiddo, these big cities, these Canaanite cities that used to be in the valleys, they exhibit a great deal of destruction in this period. So this is late 13th, early 12th. So this is about 200 years later. So if anything, in other words, what we're trying to say here is that if these conquests did take place, then the most suitable date for that would be 1200 BC.
Which is 250 years later?
Right. Which is about, 200
So unless they wandered in the desert for 290 years,
Right.
it's a little bit.
Isn't there an account of something that they didn't take over the whole place at once, but it was like
That's-
city by city?
That's the
from-
Judges. The book of Judges has a
Right.
different portrayal of the conquest than the book of Joshua, which is also a whole big debate among scholars which one is true, if any of them, and how do they reconcile each other. For example, the city of Chatzor, the book of Joshua has one version of events, how it was conquered, and then the book of Judges has another story. Was it conquered twice? Or was it the same story and different scholars had a different legend, different tradition? What's going on there? And more likely, they're referring to the same tradition. It's the same story, they just had a different version of it. It wasn't conquered twice. And so what we see is that the book of Joshua had a different interpretation of the conquest than the book of Judges. So yes, you're right. The book of Judges tends to be more aligned with the view that it was gradual. But the book of Joshua claims that it was a blitzkrieg, all at once, within a few years.
You get a little bit closer if you use the same time scaling. If you use the same time scaling that already exists in the inconsistency, and then you apply it to the 40 years, you get a little bit closer.
What does that mean?
If you rescale 40 years using the same 3.5 times, you're 140 versus 40 years. If you rescale that, then you get a lot closer to.
I'm not sure what you mean by rescaling.
Meaning you're saying that its actual meaning is 40 years. I'm saying if you rescale the 40 years, just like you have 143 versus 39. So if you adjust that to be the longer time frames, then you get closer in time to the 12th, 13th century, 13th, 12th.
Okay. Yeah.
So wait, how did the? Actually, no, never mind. I forgot my question.
All right.
Okay, I have a question. What I understand from archaeology is that the Israelite tribes, per se, have been living in Israel for a much longer time than this whole thing has been going on, than the whole legend, even though I'm not really sure how it jives with what they're saying and if you agree to this, but this is what I found, meaning to say that the Israelites have always had idols and always had certain traditions that set them apart, like monotheism, right? Like this one God. But this particular tradition, Israelite tribes, have been in Israel for like, let's say, 4,000 years versus the 2,000 that we're talking about now. Is any of what I'm saying true, or does it jive with what you're saying here?
I'm not addressing the Israelites yet. I'm still focusing on the patriarchs.
Right. Okay.
But as far as when I'm going to get to the Israelites, yes, you're right. That most scholars now believe that there was no conquest in the traditional sense of the term.
I mean, you said they were always there, and just
Correct.
the legends came
Correct.
in at a certain
Correct. But
Okay.
for that, we're going to have to get to a different. Right. Exactly. This class is about the period of the patriarchs. And a lot of the stuff that I'm mentioning about the conquest, and I'm talking from the biblical perspective. I'm not saying that there was a conquest. I'm saying if there was one,
When was
then
it?
it wasn't in the 15th century. It wasn't in 1409. That's what I'm saying. I'm not necessarily saying that it didn't take place in the 13th century, but if anything, that's a better candidate. That's a better date for this purported conquest. Okay, I'm sorry. I gotta continue.
Could you just
Yeah.
could you just explain? There's something at the end of the last slide.
Oh,
that you skipped over.
I didn't discuss this yet. Oh, you talking about the
At
previous?
the end of the previous slide, there's something about a that you skipped over. What is this? Mernepath?
Oh, the Meneptah stela. Okay. I think the picture of this is coming up soon. Okay, the Meneptah stela is a black basalt stone that was discovered in Egypt.
3 languages, right?
No. The three languages. No, the 3 languages is the Rosetta Stone.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so the Meneptah stela was discovered in Egypt, and it mentions it says like this. It says the Pharaoh Meneptah, which is the 19th dynasty, which is the 13th century BC. So, and he mentions that he went to Canaan and he wreaked havoc there. He conquered Yanoam. I think he mentions Gezer or Ashkelon, and then he mentions Israel's seed is no more.
That's the first mention of Israel.
Right. So that's the first mention that we have of the Israel. It's not the actual first mention of Israel, but it's the first mention of the Israel that we believe are the historical Israelites. There is actually also a mention of the term, but in a totally different context. It also appears in the Ebla archives, in the city of Ebla. The term Ishruel is also mentioned there, which is the same name, but it's totally different context, different time period, different everything. So the first time that the Israelites that we're talking about, they're mentioned in an outside source, outside of the Bible, is in the Meneptah stela, 1207 BC. Okay, again, to put things in perspective, 1207, this is roughly the time when there was a lot of stuff going on, a lot of movement. Okay, a lot of cities were destroyed. Established Canaanite cities for many, many centuries, and they were being overrun by the sea peoples. By the sea peoples were people who came from the Aegean, and they overran. They went south through Lebanon, the Levant, and they came also through the sea. The Egyptians struggled with them. The Egyptians mentioned them a lot. They caused troubles there also, and they were just basically pillaging the countryside and destroying everything, so that's the late 13th, early 12th century.
And this is 250 years after the biblical account of us officially portrayed.
Right, correct. It's 200 years later. It's 200 years after. If we take the biblical chronology, literally, then it comes out to 200 years later. Yes. Okay, so this is a very important slide. This next one. Okay, here. Okay, we have several items here that appear in the Bible that are very troubling, because the problem is that they didn't actually exist in the patriarchal period. Camels are mentioned. The story of Isaac, for example, does it say there that he saw Rebecca was on a camel, right?
Yes.
Not just that, but Eliezer went with camels.
Right,
too.
Eliezer, right. Eliezer.
To drink the camels.
There you go, right, there you
And
go.
even before that, Pharaoh gave Abraham as a present. He gave
Right.
camels.
He has camels. That Pharaoh, in order to appease Abraham for taking
stealing.
his wife,
Right.
Yeah.
he gave him camels. it
Thank you.
says.
There you go. So camels are mentioned very often,
Right.
right? By the way, camel and gamal, they're cognates. They're related. But anyway, they sound alike and they come from the same source. But anyway, so the camels, did they actually exist? Now, the archaeological evidence is that they didn't. I'm
I
going
mean,
to show
camels didn't exist at the time.
No, they didn't. They weren't domesticated. They weren't used as beast animals, as a
As
beast of
farm
burden.
animals or
Beast of burden, right? They're, as pack animals. That's what I meant. As pack animals.
When do they start?
When do they start? It's approximately 11th century and later. Okay, so which is much after the patriarchal period.
2,000 years later.
Right. In fact, there's a site called Tel Jemma, which is on the coast of Canaan, on the Mediterranean coast. It's probably I think it's in modern Israel. And archaeologists found a lot of adult camel bones there, and they date it to the 7th century. And so it appears that this is when they first started using the camels. And this was in connection with the Assyrians. The Assyrians were extremely active in those years, the 7th century.
BC?
This was their, yeah. Everything we say in this class is BC. And the Assyrians, in fact, are ultimately the ones that destroyed the northern kingdom. Right? They're the ones who exiled the northern tribes, and that occurred 722 BC. So and those are the years when the Assyrians became very strong, the late 8th century. And of course, a century later, they were in turn conquered by the Babylonians, and there were no more. But for that century, between about 720 until 620 BC, the Assyrians were very strong, and they ran a huge empire that stretched all the way from Nineveh, that was their capital at the time, which is on the Tigris, all the way to the Mediterranean. And they supervised this trade that was going on from the Mediterranean to Mesopotamia. And as part of the trade, the camels were used as beasts of burden from the port on the Mediterranean to Mesopotamia. So they found the bones of camels there, and so archaeology only shows that camels were domesticated in that period. In fact, we also see, for example, picture will come up later hopefully, but we see, for example, there's a cave called Beni Hassan. Has anyone ever heard of it? Beni Hassan? It's a cave in Egypt, and they have murals on it which depict Semites, okay, which is a term for which Israelites were presumably fall under that category. So these Semites are coming into Egypt and they're using donkeys, not camels. So we see that donkeys were the beast of burden at the time, not camels. Okay, next, Arabian goods. In the story of Joseph, it says, Nechot Tzri Valot, right? Holchem Lahorid Mitzrayma. So gum, balm, and myrrh, and these were goods that were commonly traded during the Assyrian period. Okay, we have records. The Assyrians left a lot of records on these things, and so the question here appears: is the biblical writer is he talking about his own time and he's projecting these things backward, or is he? You understand what I'm saying? Because as far as that's what it seems, right? That's what it seems, because because I mean I'm not saying that we have definitive proof that gum, balm, and myrrh weren't traded in 15th or 16th century BC during the times of the patriarchs, but we know for a fact from the Assyrian sources they were traded in the 7th century. So what's the connection here? Philistines. Okay, this is a serious problem. The Philistines definitely did not exist. Totally, they were not there. They were not to be found in the entire Middle East, the Levant, nowhere. They came in the 12th century. And in fact, they arrived after the Israelites. They arrived in the 12th century, and they're part of the sea peoples. Right, they're part of the sea peoples. There's a lot of records, like I mentioned them earlier. The sea peoples, they came from Anatolia, from modern Turkey. They came from the Aegean Islands, maybe from Crete, and other places in the Mediterranean. And they swarmed over these established cultural centers, the cities, and they just destroyed everything in their path. And everyone was concerned, and they even came by sea. They were trying to invade Egypt, and the Egyptians sort of held them back. But like I said, the Philistines are part of those sea peoples, and they were not there before 1200. And the Philistines, Abimelech, king of Gerar, is referred to as a Philistine. So again, we have this question of how did this biblical author, how did he come to refer to this Abimelech as a Philistine? Another difficulty is that Abimelech is a Semitic name, and the Philistines definitely were not Semitic.
Sounds like a mulak.
You know,
No,
it's
Avimelech.
Abimelech.
Oh, okay.
Oh, okay.
Where again the story happened again with Avram and Sarah, right? Or
Right.
Yitzchak and Rivka?
Right, the story is
No.
mentioned twice.
The story's mentioned twice.
First, it's mentioned with Abraham. Abraham goes
Sarah.
to right. Abraham and Sarai, they go to Gerar, but in the Abrahamic account, it doesn't mention that Gerar was a Philistine city. It says he went to Abimelech, the king of Gerar, and that's when he tried to rape her. Blah blah blah.
And Abimelech literally means the king, the
Right,
king
right.
father.
Abimelech
King
is
of Palestine.
right. So that's
also like just a title.
that's a
right?
Semitic name. In case you're not sure what Semitic means, Semitic basically means Hebrew. Okay. Hebrew. Modern Hebrew is a Semitic language. Arabic is a Semitic language. All
But the
right.
word Hebrew is only mentioned in
Why would a
Genesis.
Palestine king?
Yeah, but I'm not talking about the word Hebrew. I'm just talking about modern Hebrew is a Semitic language.
That's what he's saying.
Okay. So when I'm talking about Semitic, that's what I mean. I mean it sounds
So
as
how
you
does
can-
it? How does it know? Because you were saying that the real Israelites came along much later. But in Genesis, so how does? I just want to understand. How does the connection of the word Hebrew with the word Israelites? How do they connect?
Oh, that's a good question, and we're gonna get to that hopefully. If I haven't answered it by the end of the presentation, then I'll answer it then.
Wait a second, if Abimelech is just a title, why couldn't there were like several of them?
Several of them? There could be. The reason I'm mentioning it here is because he is mentioned as the king of the Philistines. And how does Abimelech, a Semitic name, right, come to be the king of the Philistines? The Philistines were definitely not Semitic. They came from the Mediterranean. They came from the Aegean. The Aegean area was not Semitic. That's Yephes, right? The Yephes, the Shem, Cham, and Yephes. The Semites is Mesopotamia, the Arabian Desert. The Hamites are. Sorry.
I'm sorry.
Okay, the Shem came from the Arabian Desert, and they eventually converged upon Mesopotamia, and they intermingled with them. So Shem is basically the Mesopotamia. Cham is Mitzrayim, Egypt, and Yafes is the Europe. Okay, the Greek islands, and so that's a totally different family. Okay, the sea people belong to Yafes. Different family, different language, different people.
But what's the source of that? I mean, I know that's
this is
what we're
well
taught.
established. Nobody disputes that. According to the Bible itself, and this
I
is
know, but I
and this
thought
is
that that's
corroborated
what
by
we were taught.
science that Yafes, right, is a different.
Well, the
totally different
Yafes
family.
was a real person. They were
Even if he wasn't a real person, it refers to a different category of a different tribe, right? A
So
different
whoever
kind of people,
wrote those
different language.
things, I mean, the only place, the source material of those three names is the Bible. So whoever wrote the Bible had a very vast knowledge of continents apart. And again, we're talking about a time when, crossing a continent could take a lifetime or two even.
Right.
So I mean, I don't get the context of that.
They might have known of the people that existed in that era.
In Europe,
Yeah, you're right.
Well,
the
but they
biblical
knew-
writers knew quite a bit of geography. I wouldn't dispute that. You're right. But the question is, when did they live, though?
the question,
Right.
the question is, how could one person in Mesopotamia or the Levant know about Northern Europe, for example?
They didn't
It's
know.
almost
Northern
impossible.
Europe wasn't occupied at the time. When I refer to Europe, I mean Spain, the coasts of Spain. I'm referring to the coast of Italy and Greece. Those areas were occupied, and they were mostly engaged in trade. Because
By the way, Europe is very close to the Middle East.
not
Right.
very close. So it
Well,
depends what parts of Europe.
The edge of
Yeah.
the
What's very close?
At any
It
rate,
also depends what
Morocco
scale
and-
you're talking about. It's close nowadays with modern
no,
transportation.
even with
Morocco
a
and
simple,
Spain is right
with
Or
a
by the
simple
Strait of
ship,
Gibraltar.
even with a simple ship, it would be like 30 days from Morocco
Right.
to what's
Right,
that?
just but only to
Portugal?
the west of Spain and Portugal.
Okay,
and Greece.
those are already Yafes people.
Mediterranean Europe, in other words.
yeah, Spain. There might have been a tiny colony in Spain at the time, in the second millennium BC, but that area I don't think is mentioned by the Bible. Spain is not mentioned in the Bible. I don't think. Maybe it is, but it might be one of the kings of Yafeth, maybe identified with Spain. At any rate, but definitely Yafeth is a different category, different family. And so the Philistines, this is a big question that everyone grapples with. All biblical scholars, even the conservatives who tend to place more
value.
Right, more value, more literalist interpretation of the biblical accounts, they still admit that the Philistines is an anachronism, meaning that a late writer just inserted that because at his time, during his time, there was the Philistines were occupying Gerar, for example, and so they envisioned that if Abraham visited Gerar, so they described the story as he went to the Philistine Gerar, because at the time the writer was Philistine.
But how could somebody make up?
They weren't making it up. They were just they just weren't.
So we're writing down legends they had, and the question is how would they write it down? They wrote it down according to how they knew the geography.
They weren't.
No?
You see, the problem is that these people, they weren't historians. Historiography, the writing of history, is a Greek invention. The Greeks were the first ones to write history as history. Preserve accurate details, record details. The writers of the Bible, it was all a mishmash in their mind. I mean, theology and fact and mythology, everything was mixed up. And to them, when their purpose of describing the story of Abraham, for example, was both to make a theological point, right? To say that that we have a right to this land because God promised it to Abraham. And at the same time, they were reporting some legend that maybe has some kernel of truth behind it. So for them, in other words, what I'm trying to say is that the author didn't mind inserting an anachronism into this tale because to him it wasn't a big deal. You see, for a Greek person writing history, it would have been a major problem, right? What am I telling a story about the Philistines? Abraham going into a Philistine city? Doesn't make any sense, right? Because for them, it has to be logical, it has to be accurate. But for a biblical writer who's writing several genres rolled into one, for them, I think it's a nice story.
Well, they have an agenda, that's a nice story.
Exactly. Yeah, they have an agenda. They have a theological agenda. They have history, mythology, legend. I mean, it's all rolled into one. It's all rolled into one. And so for them, I think that the biblical writer, for us, it's almost, inconceivable. How could somebody, be at ease with himself writing such an account? But I think that for him, it's not a difficulty. Okay, Abraham went to a Philistine city.
That's because their purpose wasn't really history. It was more.
Yeah, but that's the question is how weren't they embarrassed of themselves?
Because their purpose, anybody who's.
I understand, but how did they get away with it? I think that's the kind of question that you're asking, right? So my answer is they got away with it because people were not interested in accurate history.
Right,
Who cared about accurate history?
But we don't have to go too far. If you open up the Edith Torah and start reading about Rabbi Shechassan or something, you start saying, well, Kvod Kadesh, you start thinking about the literal word of these, meaning of those words, the holiness, and and he saw Berav Chachmasa, Beruach Kacho. When you're talking about things that they're actually describing, and this is in modern day 2011, you're actually writing such accounts.
There you go.
You don't need to go
So if someone reads that 200 years from now and thinks that, how did they write it?
So they think literally what they literally had was.
Because it's not about it's historical accounts. No historian is going to write down the story of that chasana like that. That is very true. That's very true. They have a different
even numbers.
point.
Do you know how they used to say tens of thousands of people came to the Rebbe or whatever?
Right.
Do you know that Rodney Street only has like 1,200 something seats, and it could only fit into the building, squeeze in maybe 3,500 people.
Who said tens of thousands? I haven't heard that.
Anyway, and they used
Okay,
to
we're
say
going to go off
tens
topic.
of thousands.
Sorry,
of
I have a
people.
limited time here. Let me continue with the program here.
Or the same thing with Ger in the Haim. They're talking about 35,000 people come for Rosh Hashanah. Did you ever go there? It doesn't fit more than 500 people with the whole entire street.
I actually lived in that.
There's no way,
Okay, yeah, all right. Next, Arameans. Here's another anachronism. Jacob is described as going to Lavan, who Arami, right? He stayed with him. He worked for him for 14 years. He married two of his daughters. And the Bible repeatedly mentions that he was an Aramean, right? And the problem is, again, Arameans are not mentioned in other historical records until 1100 BCE. So as far as we know, they didn't exist at the time. And they were extremely prominent, as far as we know, in the 9th century. Okay, they had constant skirmishes with the northern kingdom. For example, there was the story of this leper. What was his name? Naaman. Does anyone heard that story? He was an Aramean. There was an Aramean leper. He came to Israel to be cured, and one of the prophets told him to go dip into the water.
Oh yeah.
His name was Naaman. Nun Ayin Mem Nun, if I remember correctly.
Elisha.
So this was all the 9th century, 8th century, during the reign of Yerovam and onward. And so yes, the Arameans lived. That was the peak of their kingdom. and depicting Jacob to have lived with an Aramean is something that we cannot, from the historical record, we're not aware of Arameans existing there. It's not just we're not aware of them, we know that area, and there were no Arameans there, there were Amorites, that's what they called them, the Amuru, and in that region. And then the Ur of the Chaldees, I touched on that earlier. The Chaldeans, again, they were a late people. Oh, you were not here. The 7th century, the very last, the last of the Assyrians, right? The last king of the Assyrian was, I think, Ashurbanipal, right? I think that was his name, Ashurbanipal. And he was...
Melech Asher? Is that what it is?
Ashurbanipal is his English name. I'm not sure if he occurs in the Bible. Ashurbanipal.
Because we have a Melech Asher
Right.
in the Bible. Just that's what it's saying. Whatever.
I'm not sure. So that was the last Assyrian king, and he was overthrown by Nabal-Palasar, and who launched the first, the Neo-Babylonian kingdom, and that was in the 7th century BC. He was a Chaldean. This Nabal-Palasar, okay, 612 BC, the very famous date when the Neo-Babylonians destroyed Nineveh, right, which was the capital of Assyria. That was 612. Who destroyed it? It was Nabal-Palasar, who was a Chaldean. He, together with the Medians, the Medes, right? Modar, right?
And is Chaldeans Cheti?
No, custom.
Oh, okay.
Or custom. So this is what I'm telling you. The Ur of the Chaldees refers to a people who lived in the 7th century, and they are the people who we know as the ones that overthrew the Assyrian Empire, the mighty Assyrian Empire, with the help of the Medes. And so again, Ur of the Chaldees, at least this description, this epithet, Chaldees, has got to be a late description. And then Edom, we brought it up earlier, the kings, Edom, whatever you want to call it, there were no kings there before the 8th century. The kingdom of Edom only came up after the Assyrians swept through this region, after they destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel, 722 BC. They made their way south, and they somehow managed to arrange that territory because they were interested in the area for the trade. So they had to organize the area, and they installed certain puppet kings in Edom. They were operating under the hegemony of the Assyrians. And before that there were no kings in Edom. So again, we have a lot of indications.
1 second. According to the Bible, didn't Moshe talk to the king of Edom? He wanted to go through, and the king of Edom didn't let him go through.
That's exactly the problem that we're posing here.
What?
That's exactly what the problem we're posing here. All of these people, according to the biblical account, appear much earlier than we can verify from historical sources, and frequently.
Wasn't Esau Edom?
That's a later, yeah. That's a very
early.
That's a further shame that they come from.
That's a late. The biblical author said Esau is Edom. In other words, he was taking this legendary figure named Esau, this hunter, who was at odds with a civilized Jacob, and because in their view a tent dweller was a civilized person, but a hunter, and he was a wild man. You can't trust him. So, and this biblical writer said, okay, this Esau, this wild man, you can't trust. That's Edom. That's that guy over the Jordan River. That Edom. That's the Esau. Whereas my guy Jacob, he is solid. Ishtam Yoshev Ahalan.
But like we would say, the Nazis are Amalek.
Yeah, but
something.
this association of Esau and Edom is late. This archetype of Esau, I mean, this must have been centuries, maybe even millennia old, because it's simply used to describe the difference between the civilized. I'm also going to have it later in the slide. The differences between Esau and Edom.
So what you're saying is that the biblical chronology that derives from within the Bible itself doesn't jive or stem with the chronology obtained from outside sources, right?
That's true.
Isn't that what this whole page is
right,
about?
This page is this doesn't address the chronology directly. What I'm trying to illustrate here is that
timing.
What I'm trying to illustrate with this list here is that the biblical account was written at a time and from the perspective of a very late period. So all I'm trying to show here is that the account is suspect because it is written to.
But late as compared to.
Late as compared to the times when the events purportedly took place.
Based on. purportedly took place based on
Based on the biblical chronology, yes.
That's okay.
Right.
So there's a contradiction between
Right.
the chronology as derived
Right.
from within the biblical story
Right.
and the chronology and the references that based on external sources must have occurred much later or would seem
Correct.
to have occurred
Correct.
much later.
But in this case, the contradiction is so extreme that even if you modify the chronology, it's not going to work.
Okay, but what the one thing I want to understand is, so how does one derive, and I think you did it on the prior slide, but how does one derive the chronology from biblical sources? Is it from what date
I
do
did it in
we-
the prior slide.
Right, so just remind me, give me one date.
Okay.
One date that derives from biblical chronology, because I never saw anything in the
I
Bible.
mentioned- Okay, I
about-
mentioned the 480 years between the Exodus and the building of the temple. 430 years.
Between the Exodus. So how do we date the Exodus in the
That's
Bible?
what I just said. We date it through the construction of the temple. The
I
construction of the
see,
temple.
and we know when the construction of the temple
Right.
is.
Right.
Okay, now we're working
we know
our
that,
way,
that's how the
and
Shishak
now we're
conscription
working
came
our
out.
way
Remember
backwards.
I mentioned the
and
Shishak
stuff. Okay.
conscription. The Shishak conscription is one of those items that we use to synchronize the biblical events with extra biblical sources.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
So through that we know that the temple was built approximately, give or take a year or two, 966. So if we count backwards, that's how we come out with these the biblical
Okay.
chronology. All right. So. All right. Here finally we see a picture of the Meneptah stela, and we mentioned it earlier. This is where Israel occurs for the first time in an extra biblical source, and it was erected by Amenhotep III. It was discovered by Flinders Petrie, 1896 in Thebes. Thebes is in south of Egypt. I mean, in the southern section of Egypt.
Where do you see Israel?
Where do you see Israel? Okay, I think he's coming up in the next slide. Here it is. Israel is wasted, its seed is no longer. By the way, this it's inscribed in stone, but the glyphs, the actual characters are called hieroglyphs. Okay, this is the Egyptian method of writing. Has anyone heard of it? Hieroglyphics?
Yes.
Yeah. So this is the Egyptian method of writing. The Mesopotamians used a similar method, but it was called cuneiform. Both of them were not alphabet-based. This is the very earliest form of writing, and they were not alphabet-based. They were based on ideas. Each picture represented an idea, a verb or a noun.
So how do we know the phoneme? How do we know the sound?
We don't.
So how do we know it's Israel? You say this is...
Honestly, I don't know the answer because I don't know. I can't read it myself, but I do know that the phonemes cannot be determined directly, at least not in most characters. Maybe there are certain phonemes, there are certain glyphs that designate a particular phoneme. Phoneme is a
sound.
Fancy word for a sound. So if you want to know the actual sound, then it's difficult, basically, to indicate a sound. For the most part, you indicate an idea, which, by the way, gives you a certain advantage because it's portable between different languages.
Mm-hmm.
Because the same idea can, a
Stand
different person,
everywhere.
a different person understands it also.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this advantage is that you don't have the alphabet, and you can't designate a phoneme, like you said. But the advantage is that it's more portable. You don't have to learn a new language when you want to read it. So, so this is the hieroglyphs. Anyway, so this is, like I said, this is the very famous Israel or Meneptah stela, which says Israel is wasted, its seed is no longer. Seed here, by the way, refers to not human seed, it refers to grain. It means that they stole the grain.
Oh.
That's what it means, yeah.
Oh,
It
so
doesn't
it doesn't mean the destruction of Israel.
No, because in ancient times, there was no such thing as genocide. I mean, when you conquered an area, you never killed the people. You just took their possessions. You took, what does a city have? What is the most valuable commodity in a city? It's the grain.
Can I ask something?
Yes.
Because in the Bible, we see genocide multiple times. The Amalekim, the
Only the
Bedouin,
Amalek.
the
Only the
Canaan.
Amalek. And
No,
also...
No, we see it time and time again. Not just that, Moshe was angry
Canaan
at
was
Yeshua
also-
for not killing all the women that weren't virgins. Like, time and time again, you see the story of them having to kill everyone.
Only with the Amalekites. With the Amalekites.
And the
Yeah,
Canaanites.
and maybe
was
also
the
just supposed to kill the women?
Yes, yes. Not
Was
just
the
that,
Chai
they were
Kol Shema
was
goes
the
for
Chai
all
Kol
the
Shema.
seven. For all
He
the
was
seven
even
nations.
angry. Moshe Rabbeinu was angry at Yeshua for not killing everyone that wasn't virgin, and they made some you know what? Keep the virgins, but kill everybody else.
Not Moses.
Yeah.
Not Moses was angry. He didn't.
Yeah, but-
he didn't cross the river.
But
so
this is
that-
not necessarily factual, though.
Maybe
You have
sure.
to remember that.
Sure.
What the late biblical author, his perception of events,
It's not
right,
necessarily
is
accurate.
not necessarily. I don't think that the ancient people. I mean, from other cultures, from Assyrians, the Neo-Babylonians, all the other people that were contemporary with the Israelites, they never killed women and children. What's the point? You know, what do you gain out of it? When you conquer a people,
Using that logic,
you gain.
no one ever killed women and children.
You wanna exactly. Why would you kill a woman?
No, but you know for a
It's not
fact
that
that
a woman
was
commodity. The point is it was commodity at the time. Women and children were part of your family.
Exactly,
It was like
exactly.
slaves.
Women were possession.
Exactly.
Women
Why
were
would you
considered
kill
a
So
possession.
somebody
You would-
invented it at some point? Oh, that we should be ruthless and just kill everyone? I don't understand the logic.
The biblical author at the time, 7th century, he, for the purpose of his ideas, we'll go into that in a subsequent presentation, but he had a whole purpose in his writing of events, and he reinterpreted and rewrote events, and in his interpretation, it was killing women and children. In reality, I don't think they did so. Not I don't think, I'm quite convinced that they didn't kill women and children. Go ahead.
You described the author as being singular. Does that mean that it was written by
No,
one person?
no, I'm not. I'm just taking the shortcut. Authors. All right. So this is the famous. Left the story. All right, no more pictures. So, conclusion: patriarchal narrative in Genesis cannot be used as a historical resource. The reason we were pointing out that list that we saw earlier is just to show you that there is problems with history. There are anachronisms, and it needs to be interpreted on the basis of two points that I should keep in mind constantly. One is the distinctive literary history. Literary history means the history from the time it was committed to writing and onward. And this is also called text criticism. I'm sure you've heard the term, text criticism, and it means analyzing the text to determine who wrote it, when was it written, who were subsequent editors, right? Who was how many sources, how many writers are there, and etc. So this is what's called literary criticism, literary history. So that's one thing that we need to do in order to try to reconstruct what actually happened in biblical times. And the other thing we need to do is the development of the traditions upon which the literary narrative is based. That's also something you have to keep in mind. In other words, even if we can establish that this writer actually wrote this down and it wasn't edited later and it was a reliable, whatever, it was a reliable source from his point of view, right? It still underwent a whole chain of tradition. And the tradition, the oral tradition, right? The oral tradition also evolved, right? I mean, in the absence of writing, what do you think? Do you think that the tradition is preserved reliably and accurately for centuries or many generations? It's almost impossible.
I mean, playing telephone.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Playing telephone.
Right. So that's the two things you need to take into account. First of all, textual criticism, right? Who wrote it? When did he write it? And how many editors have tried to modify what he wrote? Right? And the other thing is the oral tradition behind the text.
Wouldn't it have like, I mean, isn't it pretty much the same? Or we all have pretty much the same Bible? Wouldn't there be
No.
like so many versions
No.
of it?
Well, first of all, no, we don't have the same Bible. There's a lot of there's different readings. Okay? You can have there's Septuagint, for example. If you read the Septuagint, has anyone heard of the Septuagint? It's the Greek version of the Bible. It was translated in 3rd century BC, and there's a lot of variations in the Septuagint from the Masoretic text, right? So part of textual criticism is verifying which one is more accurate.
You also have
And-
the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? Aren't
Right,
they?
the Dead Sea Scrolls also shed light on textual criticism.
Is it different? But Dead Sea Scrolls, I always wondered that.
There are some variations, yes.
There are some variations.
Yes, definitely.
And can I add something? The Bible itself, that is exactly what we're saying, right? According to biblical scholars, is written by 4 different people, and they do have different accounts. You see the creation story having different accounts, you see
Exactly.
the Noach story having different accounts. Yes, it was different traditions, and it was tried to push into sounding
People
like
just kind
it's
of
the
like
same.
made it into one.
Exactly, there was a 50 one that
Right, and there's another point that I should point out is that the Bible itself references other sources. For example, Sefer Milchamos Yahweh, the book of the wars of Yahweh, right? Sefer
Where
Milchamos
does it say
Hashem.
that? Where does it say that?
It says in one of
Yeah.
the poems there somewhere. Where does it say? Kasher Kosev B'Sefer Milchamos Hashem.
Yeah, but it could be just a reference.
No, it was
Doesn't
definitely,
mean-
there was a book. That author was basically quoting that book.
I'll give it to you in a second.
At Yohev B'Sufa, right? Doesn't it say something like that? At Yohev B'Sufa? Something like that.
You have the silver. What does
Yeah.
that mean?
Nobody knows. Rashi is also not
Vahev.
sure.
Vahev.
Vahev Besufa, right. Rashi has like 4 different pshatim over there, and nobody knows exactly what it means. That's because it's a very ancient source. He's quoting, the biblical author is quoting from a book, and I don't know if the author himself knew what it meant. But he's quoting from that book, the wars of Yahweh. So, presumably the biblical author. Whoever wrote the Bible was quoting from a book called The Wars of Yahweh.
Which means he's quoting
Where
a
does
different
it
book.
say that he's quoting it from the books?
He's going to find it.
It says in Tanakh.
In Tanakh.
In Tanakh.
It's in
as
Babylon.
it was
It's in
written.
the same. It's in the
Yeah, the
same
Farish.
line.
But there was
Okay, it says. It talks about the chronology of when they went in the desert from one place to the other. So then it says.
I remember something.
Right.
Because of that,
Okay,
the Sefer Hashem,
I actually remember
as
that.
Vahev Besufa Besanachalin Amnon.
And where is this?
this is in Bereshit, no?
It's in the mitzvah somewhere.
Numbers.
It's a
The
number.
end of Deuteronomy.
Something.
I knew it was in the mitzvah.
Number
So in the middle, not.
Yeah.
21.
I knew it wasn't that. 'Cause I
And then there's another book, another famous book that the Bible quotes is Sefer HaYashar. It's mentioned numerous times.
Yeah,
It's mentioned
that's
in
a big one.
Shoftim somewhere, and it's also mentioned in Tanakh somewhere.
There's also a Hebrew version of the whole.
Sefer Yashar, and that's also very, scholars are also debating
This-
what the actual word Yashar means.
This book
Word
is
of
available
the book of righteousness or the
Judaic
book
stores.
of... I'm sorry?
Which
This book, the Sefer Yashar, is still available in Judaic stores.
We don't know if it's the same one.
No,
But
that's not...
it's maybe interpreted. and
Whatever
take
whatever
like-
somebody is selling you in the store, that's not that Sefer Yashar. I know. The Sefer Yashar the Bible quotes is lost. Nobody
There's
knows.
also Sefer Divrei Hayamim. I don't.
Right. That's much later though.
Okay.
Sefer Divrei Hayam is already from the period of the monarchy.
That,
The
that's
Sefer
the
Divrei
Megillah,
Hayam-
that's the
You
Megillah.
can't tell
Sefer
because
Divrei
Sefer
Hayam
Hayam
was the
basically-
annals of the kings. The kings basically had a scribe who kept records. This was a
Yeah.
typical,
Right.
It's from each kingdom different.
Right.
And
Right.
each of them are close.
and that is also lost, by the way. And that's a book that stood much more of a chance of being preserved because this is from a much later period. Sefer Divrei Hayamim. Sefer Divrei Hayamim is already from the 9th, 8th, 7th century, and so anyway, all of these books are lost. So this is also related to textual criticism. You know, what kind of book are you quoting? What's the reliability of that book? Okay.
It's actually a very interesting quote. The context of this line is basically that they landed in Nachal Arnon, which was the last resort of the Jews before they went into Israel. And that's what it says. That's why it says in Sefer Mechamas Hashem, as Vayev B'Sefer Cholim Arnon.
Al-Kain, by the way, doesn't necessarily mean that's why. Al-Kain could also mean over this, on this, in reference to this.
In reference to this, that it was the last landing. That's why it says as Vayev B'Sufa Cholim Arnon. That was the last resort. So
Al-Kain literally means
it's a physical reference to why it says in that book. That
right, but do you understand what I'm saying? Al-Kain means in on this topic. It's not because.
No.
Later meaning it's
Right.
because. That's much later.
But it's a physical
in
reference.
the Bible, when it said
what I'm saying is it's a real physical reference.
right, of course.
Yeah.
But the word Al-Kain means on this topic. It is said in Mechamas Hashem. Al-Kain on this. That's the literal meaning of the word. And later in the much later time, it assumed the meaning of therefore. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the JEPD documentary hypothesis. I think that most of you already heard of this hypothesis, but let me go over it really quick. This hypothesis was initiated by scholars who detected certain differences between the style of writing and also the objective and the terms that they used to designate the tetragrammaton, God. Right? Sometimes they used Yahweh, sometimes they used Elohim. So they realized that there must have been a different author here. So that's what's called the documentary hypothesis, right? There are different documents that were later combined. Sometimes it's called different sources, different documents, different sources, and so two of the earliest sources is called JE. JE refers to Yahweh. In German, you write Yahweh is written with a J, and so it refers to the Yahwist. He's called the Yahwist because he refers to God by his name, by his proper name, Yahweh. And E is the Elohist. He refers to God as Elohim, which is, by the way, not a proper name. Elohim is simply God. Okay, it's not the same as Yahweh. Yahweh is a specific God, the God of Israel.
Mhm.
Right?
It may even be polytheistic. Elohim may even be
It, Elohim could be polytheistic. Correct? Not only could be, good point that you're bringing it up, it actually is plural.
Right.
Right.
So,
And they even
so
call it
the
Elohim.
ironic thing is that the later P source, who constantly refers to God as Elohim, and he was this pious person who lived in the 6th century, and to him, polytheism was unthinkable, but he actually refers to God as Elohim, which most likely is a vestige from polytheistic times. Because otherwise, why are you calling him Elohim?
In Hebrew,
Elohim is
Elohim
plural.
has a meaning-
It's plural for God.
Elohim has more of a like physical meaning. It's almost like a certain kind of manager kind of.
Yeah, but why isn't
Elohim
it
is very-
plural though? Why isn't it plural? Elohim is plural.
Like,
Right.
Exactly, but that's what,
Right.
exactly what they
Exactly.
say not to have.
Gods.
Elohim, okay.
Gods.
So what's the what?
In
what
fact,
is
the,
P
the
is for?
singular is El, and the Canaanite, the
Or
god
Eloha.
of
It comes from Eloha.
the, right, Eloha, yeah.
Right, Elohim, Elohim.
El, Eloha, different variations of the same
they're
thing.
very different.
But-
El is different.
But the Hey could be added.
Well, you also have na,
secondary. The
you
Hey
also
is not
have Naaseh Adam B'Tzalmeinu K'Masenu. When you say
Right.
Naaseh,
Right.
it's you're talking among yourselves. The
Exactly.
gods are talking
That's also
among
a
themselves.
vestige from
Havanera,
polytheistic times, right?
Right.
This legend,
Havanera,
right?
by
So this
the-
legend must have started in polytheistic times, and it was gods in the plural
But it-
who were convening a war council. What are we going to do about these little humans who are
Right.
not? Let's put them in place.
Wait,
I
which
have a
God?
not
question
behaving.
about your documentary hypothesis here. J.E. are two different editors then?
Yes,
Oh, and they're combined.
correct.
Okay.
J.E. was later combined,
Okay.
and then there is another source called the P. Now, what is the P? The P is definitely a different source. J.E. sometimes is confusing because you don't know who is who. And it's difficult to distinguish between the two. And also, the person who combined the two did a very good job, and he did such a good job that it's all.
Very good at cut and paste.
Yeah, basically,
Cut and
yeah.
paste.
You cut and paste a lot, and it's difficult. Sometimes you see one verse from J, the other verse from me. You don't know where one ends and the other begins. But the P's mark is very distinctive. P's style is extremely distinctive. First of all, he's concerned with all kind of ritual things. He's measurements. He always supplies measurements. It's on the 150th day. It's and dates. Very concerned. Whenever you see, for example, the first day of the month, it's P. All right. J and E refer to, let's say, Chodesh, which is the new moon. He doesn't say the first day of the month. Right? He refers to just general descriptions. And also, J.E. Sees God as more as an anthropomorphic being. Right. He describes God like you said, the Nasa Adam Tzalmeinu K'Museinu. This is a term that, this is a kind of statement that P would never make. In fact, P was probably embarrassed with this statement, and P just couldn't do anything about it because it was part of the Bible for centuries already. So all P could do is just write a different version who doesn't depict God in such human terms, in just anthropomorphic terms. And
Or like Yad.
right,
Etzba
Yad, Etzba, all of these
Etzba
terms,
Elohim,
right?
or-
All of these terms are J.E. P would never use those terms. Never
We
use
should
Yad,
mention what
Etzba.
P stands for. We should mention.
Oh, yeah, P stands for priestly, and the reason they call him priestly is because he's concerned with priestly matters. Like the entire book of Vayikra, for example, is authored by P, and there's certain large sections of a midbar also by P, and there's very few of P in for example, the book of Exodus, I believe. No, there are some. The Bereshit, there are also some. It's interspersed a little bit in Genesis and Exodus. Deuteronomy, of course, is a separate author, and that's called the Deuteronomist, which is also very disputed. When did the Deuteronomist live? When did P live? There's a lot of theories about it. I believe that P lived during the Second Temple, but many scholars believe that he lived in the late First Temple, and others believe he was during the exile. For example, the prophet.
Second temple, are you sure? There is
I
many-
believe that he lived in the beginning of the Second Temple.
Because in Novi there's many references to the what is it called? Letter.
Right.
What is it called?
Torah's Moshe?
No,
Right.
in English.
Hamid, the Pentateuch?
Pentateuch.
Pentateuch, yeah.
Yeah. So there's many references.
Such
I'm
as?
sure there's also. Oh, it's Kasha Kusa B'Toras Moshe.
Yeah, but it doesn't mean that it had 5 books.
No, but the reference it says, and many of it is from
Yeah.
Leviticus.
Torah's Moshe is a very fluid term. You don't
Yeah,
know
but
what.
When Isaiah tells the Israelites, start behaving as it claims in Torah Moshe, and most of it is in Achei Kedoshim, all these bad things that you shouldn't know.
You don't know
all
what
that
he's
come from
referring to.
Leviticus.
Again, like I said, when somebody says Torah Moshe,
He does say
the Rebbe in Chayder is going to tell you Torah Moshe refers to the Pentateuch, right? All 5
And even
books.
Rashi's going to tell
But-
you that.
No, no, but he's
But
saying
that's-
the specific quotes, the specific quotes.
Right.
You're talking about Isaiah is referring to a term, to an
certain
injunction that
mitzvahs.
only appears in the priestly source? I don't think so. Show it to me. Show it to me.
I'll check it later.
Yeah. Yeah, because no, it's almost that would be a major eye opener because as far as I know, the priestly source was not a first temple. He wasn't. He didn't live during the first temple. He lived during the second. In fact, see, the problem with the priestly source is like this: J.E. was most likely written at the very end of the first temple period, and P is so different from J.E. that it almost couldn't have been written in the same time frame. So the question is, when are you going to place it? When are you going to put P in? How do you fit him into the puzzle? Right? You can't fit him in as a contemporary of J.E. because where did he live? I mean, we're not aware of two radically different school of thoughts existing in Judea side by side at the time, and so more likely than not, he lived during the exile or later. But since he was so concerned with priestly matters, that's why I'm a little hesitant of placing him during the exile, because why would somebody write about so many priestly matters when there is no temple? So I think that he wrote during the second temple period.
But according to your view, it's impossible for Ezra to be the editor.
Why not? Ezra lived in the 5th century.
But he was like, he founded the second temple, and he's already writing from someone else's work. He's being the editor from someone else's
Ezra
work.
did not found the second temple.
He did.
Yes.
He was the
I
one
mean,
who took everyone from
Yeah.
Babylon.
He was the
brought
beginning
them back
of the
to
second
Israel.
of the
Well,
second
the
coming.
second temple wasn't built right away. Ezra was
Of
the one who
course not.
returned with the exiles.
Right.
But the
But he did
temple was
get
built
good
10,
funding
15 years
and-
later. So the priestly writer could have lived in those very early years. In those very
But then
early
he
years.
couldn't be the editor.
Why
Because he
not?
only lived at the beginning and then he died.
So it wasn't Ezra. Maybe it was someone else.
Most
was one of
scholars
Ezra's
believe it's
disciples.
Ezra. Not most.
The
but a lot
point
of
is like this.
scholars
The point
believe
is
it's Ezra.
he talks about priestly matters. So it's difficult to place him during the exile.
Why
The
can't
first
you
temple.
place him right,
what I'm saying. First temple.
right at the end
Oh,
of
first
the
temple
time?
was the same time as
Yeah,
J.E.
that
Why can't you
exactly.
place him
But
somewhere
some
in
scholars believe it was the
Isaiah's
first temple,
times?
but
Why can't you place him somewhere? I think, according to some belief, it was King Cheskiyui who came up with this whole thing.
Chizkiyahu came up with Chizkiyahu was 722 BCE, and he was the priestly source definitely lived late after Hezekiah.
Why? What's your?
Because for various reasons, I'm not going to go into this right now, but
Okay.
yeah, there's a lot of Hezekiah is still the time period of the JE source. So I mean, at the very earliest, he lived during the time of Josiah, 622, which is 100 years later.
Okay.
And maybe he lived even later, in 622. Maybe he was inspired by Josiah's reforms. Josiah is commonly associated with Deuteronomy.
Right.
That's also difficult. You got to fit Deuteronomy into the picture also. Like he had his own ideas of things. There's 4 different things, and you have to find a place for each one of them. But that's a separate discussion. The only reason I'm mentioning it here is because this is going to inform the debate of what actually happened. Because, like I said earlier, we have to discuss who wrote it and when did he write it. In order to illuminate what actually happened, we have to understand who wrote it, what was his purpose, and when did he write it. Okay, there's another point that I was trying to make. Right? And so one of the books that I read, he points out an interesting thing. Why does he mention goy? Goy means a nation. The word means a people, right? So in his words, God said to Abraham, "Leave your father's land, and I'm going to make you a big nation." Right? So this shows that the author was writing from the point of view of the monarchy, right? Because otherwise, he could have said, "I'll make you a great people." Right? So he's also saying that you're gonna have political identity and a nation.
So you're saying he should have said Ve'eskala Am Gadol.
Right. That would have been the
Instead
more
of
natural
goy.
way of expressing it. Yeah. You'll just be numerous, right? Great people. So the word goy specifically refers to a political entity. It refers to a political entity. So God saying to Abraham, "I'm going to make you a great polity." I think that's the word in English. In other words, I'm going to make you a state. right, is indicative that the person who is putting those words into God is writing at a time of the monarchy, and he's writing from the viewpoint of the established classes in the monarchy,
Sort of
which
like
is the
trying-
priesthood and the royal aristocracy, and he's writing with their interests in mind. And
But what do we know from history? When did the humanity first start to grasp? I mean, to have the concept of, let's say, a week, the very thing that we count things in seven,
week?
in multiples of
Sheva.
seven.
The word Sheva, 7.
Shavua, no,
Right,
the thing
right.
of weeks.
I don't know the answer to that.
Because that's the only time in the Bible that it's mentioned is by the Sphira, Sheva Shavuot is Parlach, right? Sheva Shavi is Tisperlach. So that's 7 weeks you should count. That's the only time. There's no other week anywhere in the
What
Bible.
about Shemitah?
Shemitah is years, not the concept of a week.
The
You
concept
said
of week, though, Shabbos, I mean, way at the beginning, right?
The division,
kind of points to
the division of time into multiples of 7, into units of 7, is very, very ancient. I don't know where it started.
Now they
But-
built the world in
It's
7
not-
days. That was 6 days and 1 day rest.
It's definitely not it's not associated with the Hebrews, with the Israelites in any way. I think it's much older than that.
What he's saying is it's not at all associated with the Hebrews.
well,
It's
you
a
were
lot
saying
older,
that
for sure.
JE would never use any concrete things like month, week.
No, not months. Days in the month. He wouldn't say, when the Torah says, for example, the 15th day of the month is a day you have to do so and so, that's P. JE never talks about exact measurements. He doesn't care, for example, the Teva, it's 300 cubits long. JE doesn't care, who cares how long it is, right? The hell with
The
it.
story of the Mabul is a
A Teva is a Teva, right? An ark is an ark. If it's 300, so the
There's two
measurements,
stories of the ark.
right? The story, 150 days, right? 40 days. All of these days, measurements, right? Those are by P. JE typically doesn't use exact measurements.
There's a yak.
JE talks like more casual, more like a novel,
By
right?
Noah's Ark,
Instead of just a scientifically accurate description, everything has to be dated and numerical.
by Noah's Ark, not only there's two stories of Noah's Ark, and not only one only talks about the exact measurements. The one that talks about exact measurements also gives the exact measurements of the animals. That there were 2 of each animal and 7 of the kosher ones. The other one just says 2 of everything. Just bring them on and let it keep on going.
That second version is a P.
The 7 version is P. The 2 version is JE. And also remember this famous contradiction between the 40 days and 150 days? Rashi is struggling with it. Everyone's struggling with it.
Right.
Rashi says two things. In one verse it says that the water was on the earth for 40 days, and the other verse it says 150. 150 is P, and the 40 is J. But anyway, that's beside the point here. Okay, so let's introduce a concept called an eponym. Has anyone ever heard the term eponym? Eponym. Eponym means a figure whose name is derived from a people based on whom that people is named. Did I describe it properly?
Yeah.
Okay. For example, let's say Americans, right? We're Americans, right? If let's say somebody were to say there was a person who once existed and his name was America.
America was Yeshua.
Right, but he was the inventor. But let's say you didn't know about him. Okay, let's say there's the founding father of America, his name was America. And after him, the continent is named. So that would be the eponym of America. It's a person based on whom the people is named.
Like the Paroinim?
What's that?
Paroinim?
Paroinim?
Paroinim, the Paros people?
Oh, yeah.
You called them the Paroinim.
Right.
People of Paro.
If there was such a thing as Paroinim, then Paro would be the eponym of the Paroinim.
Okay.
There is no such thing, but the opposite, the counterpart of an eponym is a namesake. The namesake is named after the eponym.
Like they say Abrahamic religions. Abrahamic, I don't even know how to
Israelites,
religions.
their name is Israel, and Israel
Right,
the namesake
exactly.
of the Israelite, the namesake of Israel.
Right, exactly. So the eponym is commonly used in
like
biblical.
infinity, kind of.
Right. So it comes from the word nim means name, and epa I think means like above, on top, a name on top of something, whatever. So how does it apply to biblical studies? Because in many cases, without judging a particular person, whether the person actually existed and the setting, etc., you simply designate him as the eponym of a certain people. For example, you have the tribes, the 12 tribes of Israel, right? Now we know that the tribes, meaning the actual people, we know that they existed. You know, you had Ephraimites, you know, you had Manassites, you know, you had Judahites, certainly, and the people existed. We don't know that Asher existed, or Naphtali, or Gad, right? The eponym existed. The eponym meaning the person
underlying.
Right, underlying
Judah existed.
Right, right. So without so ancestor isn't like a very reliable term because who said he was the ancestor, right? So the term we usually use is eponyms, and eponym is a common feature in the Bible because very often we see that the author basically created these personas to match to the actual people that existed on the ground. For example, Ammon and Moab, right? They were the children of Lot and his daughters, right? And so again, we have the Ammonites and Moabites were actually historical people, but the story behind them, in other words, the eponyms of the Ammonites and the Moabites, those are, it's questionable. But clearly, I mean, this is an incestuous union, right? And so the biblical writer, it seems, has an agenda here to portray these hostile neighbors across the Jordan in a negative light, right? I mean, telling a story like this, he certainly wouldn't tell a story like that about his own people, but those Ammonites and Moabites, that the father had a relationship with had the relationship with their daughter, and that's how they were born. So that's a good example of eponyms whose historicity is questionable. And then you have Edom, another example, right? As a person, right? Edom as a historical person, and others.
So Adam and Eve.
There are no Adamites.
Adam.
No,
Well,
Adam wouldn't be
there are-
considered an eponym because there aren't people called Adamites.
We're all.
But-
Adam is a person. I see what you're saying.
Oh.
But let's say Shem, like you mentioned before, right?
Semites,
Yes.
very good example.
Right.
Yes, Shem. Shem is Shem is an eponym of Semites, right? So in other words, what I'm trying to say here is that Shem didn't necessarily exist. He is named after people who speak a common language, right? That is commonly designated as Semitic. So we presume that there was a certain ancestor whose name was Shem, and he was the common ancestor of all these Semites. So he's the eponym of the Semites.
Because it is hard to say that a whole people came from one person. It's true.
Right.
Why would any community start from one person?
Right.
It's after that.
Yeah,
they
exactly.
said,
There could have been
decided-
people who joined the Semites, they learned the language, and now they're part of them. This person wasn't a descendant from Shem, from this eponym Shem. So the eponymous ancestors of Israel's enemies are born of incestuous union of Lot and his daughters Moab and Ben-Ami. Jacob outwits Esau, who was called Edom, and wins the birthright and blessing. What I'm trying to point out here is that that the biblical account isn't very reliable because it's showing its neighbors in a negative light and is creating certain personalities and is painting them negatively. And the same applies to Ishmael. Ishmael is described to be the son of Abraham and Sarai's Egyptian maid Hagar. So again, you have people, tribes who are living in southern Judea, and the biblical author presumably, how does he fit them into the puzzle, right? Who are they? Where are they? Whom are they descended from? So he said, "Ooh, I have a good idea. Egypt is to the south. Abraham controls Canaan. So let's do a union, a disreputable union here, okay? Not the actual wife, just a concubine, a handmaiden. And Abraham marries this handmaiden from Egypt, the neighbor to the south, and that created the Ishmaelites who lived between Canaan and the south.
And maybe he said he threw them to this desert because they were the desert people.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Jacob, I wouldn't think that one person decided to create this.
It's not one person. This is
a
how
legend that developed.
Right.
Like that.
Thank you.
More,
Exactly.
right.
Exactly. I'm oversimplifying.
Right.
But these legends evolved based on. They're called in English. It's called an etiology, right? Describing something, how it started. Right? How did the Israelites come to be here, and what's their relationship to us? Right? How are they? How do we define them in relation to us? So yeah, that's a very nice definition. And also, So the character of Ishmael is not, what I'm trying to point out here is that the character of Ishmael is not a historical character. It's not that they had a tradition that there was a person named Ishmael who had so many children and one of them went to the south and inhabited the desert and blah blah blah. It's rather seeing the current situation, seeing that there are people who are living in the desert, and seeing a common feature, and then creating this ancestor who unites them, and also creating the story that fits well with the description of the actual people, right? So you have this story who describes them as descendant from Hagar, who is from Egypt, since they live between Canaan and Egypt.
And fits with the purposes of the writer as well. Like, who was his brother? Yishmael's brother was Yitzchak?
Isaac.
Yeah, so Yitzchak's the one who inherits the land, he's the chosen son, and
Exactly.
Ishmael is the one who's thrown out.
Thrown away to the
Right,
desert. That's
Right, so it fits the political purpose.
So this narrative
So
also, right, good point. So
the
this
prophet
narrative
Yahweh,
also
yeah.
reinforces the Israelite claim on the land, because it's showing that God promised land to Abraham, and his legitimate child was Isaac. But whereas the Ishmaelites are descended from the handmaiden, and therefore they don't have a legitimate claim to the land. Go ahead.
I was just saying, I think it was interesting because, like, when you think about Ishmael, how, for example, in that region of the south, like in the Arabian Peninsula, they kind of took that story and reversed it and saying, like, Ishmael.
The Arabs believe that Ishmael is the favorite son.
Yeah,
Very good.
everyone has it the
Right.
opposite way, yeah.
Right.
Very good.
According to the Arab, according to the Quran, right? The Quran, it says, "Kaflachas binchas yichidcha shahab." Doesn't say a name. That then it says it's Yitzchak. This could have been a gloss, right? And the Arabs actually believe so. They believe that the favorite son, the beloved son,
Was Ishmael.
was Ishmael.
The Aqidah was
So basically, they're flipping everything, the entire account. They're just flipping it on its head. It's not Isaac, it's Ishmael.
But it does say as Yitzchak. It says Kafel ben
Yeah, but why is it?
I should have to.
Why does it?
Yitzchak.
Right,
Oh, okay.
but remember,
That's what it is,
the account could have been edited, right?
Right.
This Israelite could have inserted as Yitzchak. The original legend could have been simply your son.
Favorite son.
But what do they do with
In
Jacob
fact,
and everything else?
In fact, it's a little suggestive that this text was edited, because why 3 times? And Rashi also grapples with that, right? There's Binchas,
He
Yichidcha.
explains that
Right.
it's
Actually,
just
the
the
most
love
hard.
and
Right.
Every
The Yichidcha
word's
is very
most hard.
important because that says that this is your really, the Yichidcha says your only one, your only legitimate son. So your son, which son? Your only son, which
But
only
that's
son?
exactly what they say about the Ishmael. They say that he was the one that was born.
Sure, no, I'm saying,
You know.
it's interesting, we start
The
looking
point
at-
is that the back in those times, ink was precious, paper was precious. Paper didn't actually exist, but people didn't typically write this way. Take your son, your beloved one, the only one, just name him.
Sorry, I just wanted to tell you we need to stop in 10 minutes.
All right. And so yeah, so that's okay. So I want to mention here a very important character in biblical archaeology. His name is William Foxwell Albright. Anyone ever heard of him? W.F. Albright. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Very important person. Now, in relation to our discussion here, the reason he's so important is because he espouses a certain view of biblical history that is more literal than many other scholars, especially modern scholars. He essentially believed that the historical accounts of the patriarchs and others were more or less true. They were based on an accurate tradition that, of course, was not every detail is true. For example, the Philistines we mentioned earlier. I mean, he would still admit that something went on there, right? A late editor inserted that, but basically the general outline of it, the fact that Abraham, for example, originated. There was a historical person named Abraham. He originated from Ur of the Chaldees. He made a migration northward to Haran, etc. The framework of this account is accurate. That's his position. The details may have been tampered with, but the general outline is accurate. Other scholars believe that the entire thing was basically a figment of the writer in late Judean monarchy. And other scholars believe something in between, that there was some tradition behind it, but it's not reliable anymore to the extent that we can trust it to transmit a historical account. In other words, there's a kernel of truth behind it, but the way it's described in the Bible is already unreliable. So he assumes the conservative view here, which is that the Bible is generally true. I have a quote from here coming up. I think it's going to be in one of the upcoming slides. But he has a very powerful quote in which he says, let's see if it comes up soon. Yeah, here it is. Okay, here it is. As a whole, the picture in Genesis is historical, and there is no reason to doubt the general accuracy of the biographical details and the sketches of personality which make the patriarchs come alive with a vividness unknown to a single extra-biblical character in the whole vast literature of ancient Near East. Now, I think that this is also, a problem, because how does he come alive so strongly when you're writing so many centuries after the purported events took place? So on the one hand, he was so fascinated by it, he's saying, wow, this is incredible. But on the other hand,
If there were books at that time, how come there weren't more books? If there were stories, how come there wasn't more stories?
There was. Other peoples have other legends and other stories that are totally contradictory. No Adam and Eve, no God, this God, a total different God. I mean, look in India, look in Africa, they have total different tradition, total different books.
But, I mean, even in the same place, it could have been, I guess people destroyed it because the believers of one Bible destroyed everything else.
The reason the Bible is the strongest from this point is because of the major religions that came out of it, not us. It's more Christianity and Islam that are based on the biblical account. But otherwise, there is a ton of different books. There is a ton.
And they destroyed most of the other ones, I guess, sometime along the way.
Yeah.
Unless it was too far to destroy, like in Africa or India or in America.
Yeah, the Bible survived to a large extent because Christianity.
Exactly.
Because
they may have them.
Yeah. In fact, Judaism survived because of Christianity, in my opinion.
Exactly.
If not for the Christians, we might not have been Jews today.
Right.
We probably would have been, assimilated into some polytheistic religion. Perhaps.
I wonder if also the fact that it was written it was written in an alphabet. You know what I mean? Some of these other things.
Right. Yeah. But the alphabet already existed. The other accounts were written. I mean, the Greeks also wrote in an alphabet at about the same time that the Bible was written.
Alphabet is a Canaanite.
Right.
Right. It's a Canaanite.
Right. It's a Canaanite invention, a Phoenician invention, 12th century.
Well, there you go. The Greeks wrote stuff at the same time. The Code of Hammurabi is older. Hammurabi. Sorry,
Right.
I'm very bad pronouncing.
Code of Hammurabi.
But that is older than the Bible, and it's still right here, and it's a total different account with different laws, with different stuff.
Actually, it's very similar to the biblical laws.
It's sense.
In fact.
But it's from in the same area.
The Code of Hammurabi is so strong, and it's so similar to the biblical laws that it is hypothesized that more likely than not, but the Bible took its laws from Hammurabi's laws, not vice versa, because Hammurabi lived in the 18th century BC.
He was a king, right?
Yeah, he was an Amorite king, and he controlled vast stretches of Mesopotamia at the time, in the 18th century. And so that was Hammurabi.
It's like even before Abram, right? Or close, no, between
No, he was actually, according to Albright, I mentioned according to Albright because according to other scholars there is no historical Abraham. So according to Albright, the historical Abraham existed before Hammurabi. He existed in the 21st to the 20th century, several centuries before Hammurabi. Because Hammurabi, according to Albright, this is the next topic of our conversation, which is very fascinating. Unfortunately, we don't have time. But according to Albright, Abraham was an Amorite. And there was a huge, according to his theory, there was a huge Amorite migration going on. They were conquering basically the large urban centers of Mesopotamia at the time, which were run by the Akkadians. At the time, the Akkadian Empire was in existence. And the Amorites came in there. There was a migration or a invasion from the south or from the west. Amorites literally in Sumerian means westerners. So they migrated and they came in and they took over these urban centers and they caused a lot of destruction. And eventually they reestablished those cities. And Hammurabi was one of those Amorites who came in control of the Sumerian city-states.
What does Albright do with the time pattern? Does he still use the Bible as accurate timing? Because historically, archaeologically, it doesn't make any sense.
Right, according to him, the Exodus took place in the 15th century.
But he's a 19th century archaeologist, right? So since then...
Albright lived in the 20th century.
20th century.
Yeah. He lived...
How does he coincide the...
How does he do it? Well, for one, the reason that he could exist is because archaeology wasn't as developed in his time. He wrote mostly between the wars, between World War I and World War II, and
Since
some
then
of the
it's been
biblical
evolved.
archaeology was still in its infancy.
Most of
a modern
archaeology
archaeologist cannot get away with his beliefs anymore. I mean,
So Albert had carbon dating. Was there at the
carbon dating for sure not.
So then
No.
why is it
Barely.
incredible?
They barely even had pottery dating.
Right.
The first form of dating
so
was
why is
pottery.
it incredible? Why is
Ceramic
it
dating.
mentioned now?
What?
Why is he credible then? If he doesn't if it didn't have such, I mean, these are the tools that could establish
Why
so
he's
much.
credible?
Yes.
Because he established biblical archaeology, that's why. He was the first one to dig. He was an actual archaeologist, and also the other thing you should realize is what was before him. Okay, before Albright, people took the Bible literally, and if the Bible said so, then it is so. So the fact that he actually had the ability, and he was a religious person, so the fact that he could come to the scene and say, hey, this Bible, I'm still religious, God is still out there, and at the same time have the gumption to say, okay, but let's see what the Bible is actually talking about, right? I mean, they're not. He didn't basically shut himself out from studying
From reality.
So-
from reality, right?
But-
Out of fear that it might contradict the Bible.
So-
that's the hallmark of Albright, and that's very, very important.
So Albright is important in the history of biblical archaeology,
Correct.
Exactly.
but he's
But not
no
least.
longer.
His views are no longer considered accurate.
But his views
Yeah.
are no longer relied upon. So
Correct.
he's being mentioned here as part of just the
Pioneer.
history.
But-
He's the pioneer. He's the
Right.
father.
But he's also the starting point for any discussion. Meaning, in
Right.
other words, what we're trying to say is
the
he's-
first scientific approach.
He's the person who tried. He was
Right.
unsuccessful in the end,
Coincided.
but at least he tried to make it work.
And when we're talking about
I mean,
conservative
before him,
biology-
we're talking about people who are not even trying, right? They're not even taking any other evidence into account. They're not even posing any questions. So he at least he posed the questions. He came up with some answers, bedoichik, right? It seemed that it worked for him, and then certain scholars. In fact, his views were still widely popular until the 1960s, 70s. And in the 1970s, there was a surge of new archaeology, and of course in Israel there was a lot of archaeological activity going on. Yigal Yadin, Yochanan Aharoni, and a lot of others, and also the archives at Ebla, for example, were discovered in the 1970s. So a lot of new research came to light, and ultimately his views were debunked. But surprisingly, even after the war, his views were still considered mainstream. All right, so unfortunately I have to leave it at here. I hope this course was very informative.
For the rest of the classes.
Oh,
Yeah.
thank you.
Did you already have that?
No.
Oh.
So what's the next
Sorry.
date? So
Yeah.
what's the next date?
So the next date here is Tuesday, November 1st.
Got it.
2 weeks.